The sharp crack of splintering would echo across the dusty road just as Clara's wagon lurched hard to one side. Before she could steady herself, the left wheel collapsed into the ruts, scattering books, chalk, and a small wooden box across the prairie. She had traveled 3 days to reach this little cattle town, and in a single heartbeat, her journey had come to a standstill. Clara climbed down, brushing the dust from her skirt as she stared helplessly at the shattered wheel. The driver scratched his head and muttered that the nearest repair shop was still half a mile away. Around them, a pair of passing cowboys tipped their hats with friendly smiles, promising to send someone back if they found help. Their horses disappeared beyond the bend, leaving only silence and the warm afternoon wind. Then came the slow, rhythmic sound of iron striking leather. A broad-shouldered man approached from the opposite direction, leading a dark bay horse. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing powerful forearms marked with old burns and tiny silver scars. A heavy toolbox hung from one hand. Without asking unnecessary questions, he knelt beside the broken wheel, studying the cracked axle as though it had already told him what it needed. Within minutes, the stranger removed the damaged pin, carved a temporary wooden brace from a spare block he carried, and fitted the wheel back into place with practiced precision. Every movement was calm, deliberate, and certain. It was the kind of confidence earned through years of honest work rather than loud words. Clara gathered the last of her books and finally found her voice. "Thank you, sir." The man simply nodded. "Safe travels, ma'am." Then he lifted his toolbox, gave the wheel one final inspection, and walked away toward the forge at the edge of town before she could even ask his name. If you've ever met someone whose kindness arrived so quietly you almost fail to notice it, then you already know how the greatest chapters of a life sometimes begin. By sunset, Clara had settled into the boarding house beside the school. The landlady poured her a warm supper, while neighbors stopped by to welcome the new teacher. Before long, the conversation turned to the town's young ranch hands and handsome cowboys. "Give a few months," one woman laughed. "A cowboy around here will steal your heart sooner or later." The room filled with cheerful agreement. Clara smiled into her cup before answering with a softness that nearly disappeared beneath the laughter. "I think I'd rather be a blacksmith." Everyone chuckled, believing the schoolteacher was simply teasing. No one noticed the quiet figure across the street, where sparks floated into the evening sky from the old forge. And before another sunrise, that same blacksmith would begin changing Clara's life in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The next morning, the bell above the little schoolhouse door refused to ring. Children had already begun gathering outside, some carrying worn slates beneath their arms, others chasing each other across the yard. Clara reached up, tugged the rope twice, and frowned when nothing happened except a dull scrape from somewhere above. "I reckon the old thing's finally given up," one of the boys said. Before Clara could decide what to do, a familiar voice answered from behind. Not the bell. She turned to find the same quiet man from the road standing beside the porch, a leather tool bag resting against his leg, the beam holding it. Only then did Clara realize she still didn't know his name. Without another word, he climbed the ladder, leaning against the bell tower. Every step was careful, every movement measured. The children watched in complete silence as he removed the cracked timber that had begun to split beneath the weight of the iron bell. One careless pull, and the whole thing might have crashed into the schoolyard. An hour later, the beam had been replaced, fresh bolts tightened into place, and the bell rang again with a bright, clear sound that echoed across the valley. The children burst into applause. Samuel only wiped the sawdust from his hands. "Much obliged, Mr. Samuel," the oldest boy called. So that was his name. Clara smiled. "Thank you again." He tipped his hat. "Just doing my work, ma'am." Before anyone could offer another word, he gathered his tools and walked back toward the forge. During the following weeks, Clara began noticing something the rest of the town seemed to accept without thinking. Whenever something broke, Samuel appeared. a loose desk leg, a cracked school window before winter winds arrived, a stovepipe that threatened to fill the classroom with smoke, a broken fence where children played after lessons, even the rusty hinge on the front gate. Every repair was completed before anyone had time to complain. More often than not, Samuel accepted only enough money to replace the iron he had used. Sometimes he accepted nothing at all. He never could charge folks what his work is worth, the boarding house owner said one evening while serving supper. Been that way since before his wife passed. The words lingered in Clara's mind. His wife. She hadn't known. A few days later, Clara baked a small apple pie using a recipe her mother had taught her years before. She stood outside the forge longer than she cared to admit. Inside, the steady rhythm of hammer against glowing steel filled the air. Orange sparks danced through the dim workshop, while Samuel shaped a horseshoe with patient precision. He noticed her only after placing the iron back into the fire. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You ain't." She lifted the pie with a slightly nervous smile. "I thought perhaps someone who works this hard forgets to eat." For the first time, Samuel's serious expression softened. "That's mighty kind." They shared the pie on 2 overturned barrels outside the forge. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. It felt comfortable. Clara spoke first. "My students say you're the strongest man in town." Samuel gave a quiet chuckle. They've never met the mothers raising him. That answer surprised her. "So you like children?" "I like seeing them safe." His voice carried no pride, only certainty. Their conversations became a quiet habit. Some mornings Clara stopped by with fresh coffee before class. Other evenings she borrowed a book from the small shelf inside Samuel's house, returning it a week later with careful notes tucked between the pages. They spoke about novels, about growing vegetables in stubborn soil, about why children learn faster when they felt safe instead of frightened. Samuel listened far more than he talked. Yet whenever he did speak, every word seemed chosen with care. Clara found herself looking forward to those brief conversations more than any social gathering in town. The townspeople noticed, too. At the mercantile, old Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. The teacher spends an awful lot of time near the forge. Another woman laughed. "She'll come to her senses soon enough. Nice fellow, Samuel, but she's far too young. One of those young cowboys will sweep her right off her feet." Samuel happened to hear those words while delivering a wagon axle. He kept walking without turning his head. But they followed him all the way back to the forge. That evening, as he banked the fire for night, he looked at his reflection in the dark window. Gray had begun creeping into his beard. Fine lines rested beside his eyes. He remembered another face, another laugh, another wedding ring that had long since been placed inside a small wooden box. He closed the box gently. "No," he whispered to the empty room. She deserved someone with more years ahead than behind. Outside, the last light faded beyond the prairie. Inside the forge, Samuel quietly built another wall around his own heart. He never noticed Clara standing across the street for just a moment, smiling toward the glow of the forge before continuing home, completely unaware that the man she admired had already begun convincing himself to let her go. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and longer shadows, and by then, Clara had become as much a part of the little town as the schoolhouse itself. Every morning she crossed the square carrying a stack of books, and almost every morning she found something new that Samuel had quietly repaired before anyone else had noticed it needed fixing. Yet Samuel had become more careful. When Clara stopped by the forge, he always welcomed her with the same gentle courtesy, but their conversations ended sooner than they once had. If she brought fresh coffee, he thanked her warmly before returning to the anvil. If she lingered, he found another wagon wheel to inspect or another horseshoe to finish. He feared that if he stayed too long, the hope growing inside him would become impossible to bury. Clara noticed the distance, but misunderstood its cause. She wondered if she had spoken too often, visited too frequently, or mistaken simple kindness for friendship. Neither of them realized they were protecting the other from the very same fear. One Saturday afternoon, the whole town gathered for the annual livestock fair. Young ranch hands competed in riding contests, while families filled the boardwalks with laughter. The music from a fiddle drifted through the square, and children chased one another between wagons decorated with ribbons. Among the riders, one man drew nearly every eye: Daniel Carter. He was handsome, confident, and known across 3 counties as one of the finest cowboys on the range. Mothers admired his manners. Fathers respected his work ethic. Young women whispered whenever he rode into town. Seeing Clara standing beside her students, Daniel removed his hat and walked toward her. "Miss Clara." She smiled politely. "Mr. Carter. I've been hoping you'd allow me the honor of supper tomorrow evening." Several nearby townspeople exchanged knowing smiles. "There it is," one old rancher whispered. "Just like we said." Across the street, Samuel was fitting a new iron tire onto a wagon wheel. The hiss of hot metal striking water drowned out the conversation, but he did not need to hear every word to understand what was happening. He kept his hammer moving, one steady strike after another. Daniel was everything Samuel believed Clara deserved: young, strong, well-respected, a man with decades still waiting before him. Samuel lowered his eyes to the glowing iron. "That's the future she ought to have," he told himself. He worked until long after sunset, though no customer had asked him to. The following evening, Daniel arrived at the boarding house, carrying a bouquet of late-season wildflowers. "I thought perhaps we might take a walk after supper." Clara accepted the flowers with genuine appreciation. "They're beautiful." Hope brightened Daniel's face. "But—" Her voice remained soft. "I'm afraid I must disappoint you." His smile faded. "Have I offended you somehow?" "No. You simply aren't the man my heart has been waiting for." Daniel stood quietly for a long moment before offering a respectful nod. "I can't argue with a lady's heart. You've been kinder than most men would be. I'd rather lead with my pride than with your pity." He tipped his hat and walked away without bitterness. From the porch across the street, 2 elderly women watched the exchange in stunned silence. She turned down Daniel Carter? I never thought I'd live to see the day. By the next morning, nearly everyone in town had heard the story. No one understood why. A week later, dark clouds rolled across the prairie. The first cold storm of the season arrived just after midnight. Wind slammed against shutters. Rain lashed the windows. The old schoolhouse groaned beneath every powerful gust. Samuel woke before dawn. Even above the howl of the wind, he recognized a sound that made his stomach tighten. With tearing loose, he pulled on his coat, grabbed his lantern, and hurried toward the school. Half the roof above the classroom had begun lifting away from the rafters. Another strong gust would send it crashing into the yard. Without waiting for daylight or help, Samuel climbed onto the roof alone. Rain soaked him within minutes. His hand slipped across wet timber as he drove iron spikes into fresh beams. More than once, the wind nearly threw him from the roof. Still he refused to climb down. "The children will need this place Monday," he muttered through clenched teeth. "They'll have it." Hour after hour, the hammer echoed through the storm. By sunrise, the roof held. Samuel quietly gathered his tools before anyone saw him. He returned to the forge with soaked clothes, aching shoulders, and hands burned where the rain had turned hot iron into clouds of scalding steam. He never mentioned the night's work. Monday morning, Clara arrived expecting to find disaster. Instead, she found a solid roof, new support beams, fresh iron brackets, every broken shingle replaced. She ran her fingertips across the new timber. It couldn't have repaired itself. The caretaker scratched his beard. Only one man in town could have finished all this before sunrise. Samuel. Clara crossed the muddy street immediately. Inside the forge, she found him wrapping a clean cloth around one hand. Before he could hide it, she saw the angry red burn stretching across his palm and wrist. What happened? Samuel instinctively pulled his hand back. It's nothing. She gently caught his wrist. No. Her voice trembled. It isn't. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally, with a faint smile, he answered. The school needed its roof. Clara looked from his injured hand to the soot covering his shirt. You did alone? There wasn't time to wake anybody. Emotion caught in her throat. You could have been killed. Samuel simply shrugged. The children needed somewhere warm to learn. At that moment, Clara understood something she had never fully seen before. Samuel never helped people because someone might thank him. He helped because, in his heart, there had never been another choice. And without realizing it, the quiet admiration she had carried for weeks began transforming into something far deeper, something that no handsome cowboy, no charming smile, and no easy promise could ever replace. The burns on Samuel's hand healed slowly. No matter how carefully he wrapped them before beginning another day's work, the scars remained visible. Clara noticed that he favored his left hand now when lifting iron, though he never complained. If someone asked whether he was hurting, he always answered the same way. I've had worse. But Clara had begun to understand that the deepest wounds were never the ones she could see. Winter settled gently over the valley. One evening, Clara arrived at the forge carrying fresh coffee and a loaf of warm bread. Snow rested on the fence posts, and the last customer had already gone home. Samuel was repairing an old rocking horse someone had found in a barn. Clara smiled. I thought you mostly work with iron. I do. Then why mend wooden toys? The Henderson boy lost his father last spring. He carefully sanded one rough edge. I reckon he deserves one Christmas that feels like a child's. Clara watched his rough hands, shaping the toy with astonishing tenderness. In that quiet moment, she realized something. The strongest hands she had ever known were also the gentlest. As the weeks passed, Clara visited more often. Sometimes they spoke about books. Sometimes about the children at school. Sometimes they simply watched sparks rise into the evening without speaking at all. Silence never felt uncomfortable with Samuel. It felt like home. Yet every time Clara's smile lingered a little longer, Samuel found another reason to end the conversation. He feared hope far more than loneliness. One snowy afternoon, Clara noticed a small wooden box sitting on a shelf inside the house behind the forge. Samuel quickly reached for it. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to pry. He looked at the box for a long moment before placing it on the table. You didn't. For the first time since they had met, Samuel opened the lid. Inside rested a simple wedding band. Beside it lay a tiny pair of knitted baby booties, yellow with age. Clara's heart tightened. My wife, Mary. His voice barely rose above a whisper. She died bringing our son into the world. He paused, unable to continue for several seconds. The little fellow lived less than an hour. The room fell completely still. I buried them together on the hill outside town. Samuel gently closed the box. After that, I figured my life belonged to work. Clara reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over his scarred one. She said nothing. No words could have carried more comfort than that simple touch. From that day forward, Clara no longer admired Samuel only for his kindness. She loved him because he had carried unbearable grief without allowing it to harden his heart. He still repaired broken wagons, still sharpened plows without charging enough, still fixed toys, still mended school desks before children returned on Monday mornings. Pain had never made him selfish. It had only made him quieter. The townspeople, however, continued drawing their own conclusions. Surely Miss Clara will marry eventually. It won't be Samuel. He's old enough to be her father. The blacksmith's a good man, but she deserves a younger life. Those careless words drifted to the town often enough that Samuel finally began believing them completely. One afternoon, a messenger arrived from a neighboring settlement nearly 30 miles away. Their blacksmith had retired. They were offering Samuel his own larger forge, better pay, and a small house already waiting. He folded the letter carefully. No excitement crossed his face, only resignation. That evening, he stood outside the schoolhouse, watching children laugh as Clara dismissed her class. She belonged here. She had friends. A future. If he stayed, people would continue talking. If he left, perhaps she would finally choose a happiness everyone expected for her. By sunrise, his decision had been made. News traveled quickly through a small town. Before noon, the boarding house owner hurried into the school. "Miss Clara." "What is it?" "Samuel's leaving." The chalk slipped from Clara's fingers. "Leaving?" "He rides out tomorrow." For a heartbeat, she simply stood frozen. Then she gathered her coat and ran. She crossed the square without noticing the curious looks around her, past the mercantile, past the church, past the corral. She reached the forge just as Samuel finished loading the last crate onto his wagon. "You can't leave." Samuel turned slowly. "I've accepted another position." "So suddenly?" "They need a blacksmith." "We need one, too." He smiled sadly. "You'll do just fine without me." Clara stepped closer. "No." Her voice trembled. "We won't." Samuel looked away. "If I stay..." He struggled to finish the sentence. "The people keep expecting something that shouldn't happen." She stared at him, unable to understand. He finally forced himself to say the words he had rehearsed all night. "A cowboy will make you happier than an old blacksmith ever could." Silence settled between them. Clara's eyes filled, not with anger, but with heartbreak. For a long moment, she simply looked at the man who had spent months convincing himself he was unworthy of the very love standing before him. Then, almost in a whisper, she answered, "I told him that day." Samuel slowly lifted his eyes. "That I hoped it would be a blacksmith." Everything around them seemed to disappear. The forge, the wagon, the wind, the town. Samuel simply stood there, unable to speak, realizing that the quiet which Clara had spoken months before had never been a joke at all. It had been the truth. Samuel stared at Clara as though the world had forgotten how to turn. The words she had whispered months before, words everyone else had dismissed with a laugh, suddenly echoed through every quiet moment they had shared. The pie she had carried to the forge, the cups of coffee that had somehow arrived just before dawn, the books with little notes tucked between their pages. She had never been waiting for a cowboy. She had been waiting for him. Samuel lowered his eyes. "I'm too old, Clara." His voice cracked more than he wanted it to. "My hands are scarred. My beard's gone gray. I've got more yesterdays than tomorrows." Clara stepped close enough to take those scarred hands into her own. "I never went looking for someone younger." She smiled through tears. "I spent years caring for people I loved. I learned that life isn't built on handsome smiles or grand adventures." She squeezed his hands gently. I was looking for someone who makes me feel safe. Samuel felt something inside him finally give way, not from weakness, but from relief. For years he believed love belonged to younger people, to men with easier lives and unbroken hearts. Yet the woman standing before him saw not his age, but his character. With trembling fingers, he reached for her hand. "If you're willing to share your life with an old blacksmith." Clara laughed softly before he could finish. "I've been willing for a very long time." For the first time since Mary had died, Samuel smiled without carrying sorrow behind it. Spring arrived wrapped in wildflowers. The wedding was held beneath the old oak tree beside the church, exactly as Clara had hoped. There was no grand procession, no expensive dress, no orchestra, only neighbors who had become family. Children from Clara's classroom scattered flower petals along the path, while the town pastor waited with a weathered Bible in his hands. Around the yard hung dozens of horseshoes Samuel had forged through the years. Each one had been polished until it caught the afternoon sunlight, forming simple arches that welcomed every guest. Old Mrs. Henderson dabbed tears from her cheeks. "I always thought she'd marry a cowboy." Her husband smiled. "I reckon she found a stronger man." Even Daniel Carter had ridden in from his ranch. He shook Samuel's hand firmly. "You take good care of her." Samuel answered with quiet certainty. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Married life did not change who they were. It simply gave their kindness a home. Each morning, Clara walked to the schoolhouse with books tucked beneath one arm. Each morning, Samuel opened the forge before sunrise, the steady ring of his hammer becoming as familiar to the town as the church bell. Children often wandered into the forge after lessons. Some wanted to watch sparks dance across the anvil. Others simply wanted to hear Samuel's stories while learning how patience could shape stubborn iron into something useful. "Don't rush the metal," he would tell them. "It remembers every impatient strike." One autumn afternoon, Clara brought a quiet boy to the forge. His parents had died during a fever the previous winter. He rarely spoke, but whenever he passed Samuel's workshop, he stopped to watch. The boy's name was Benjamin. Samuel handed him a small hammer. "Care to learn?" Benjamin nodded. From that day on, the boy returned every afternoon. Months became years. The empty house behind the forge slowly filled with laughter that neither Samuel nor Clara had dared hope to hear again. When the adoption papers were finally signed, Benjamin hesitated outside the front door one evening. "May I call you, Pa?" Samuel swallowed hard before answering. "I'd be honored, son." Inside the kitchen, Clara quietly wiped away tears before setting another plate on the table. The house that had once echoed with silence now echoed with family. Years slipped gently by. Samuel's hair turned completely silver. His hammer swung a little slower. Yet every evening, just before closing the forge, he still looked toward the schoolhouse, waiting for Clara to appear at the end of the street. She always did. One afternoon, after class, a curious student walked beside Clara. "Mrs. Turner," the little girl asked, "everyone says people expected you to marry a cowboy." Clara smiled. "They did." "Then why did you marry Mr. Samuel?" Across the street, Samuel was tapping the final horseshoe of the day into shape, the familiar sound carrying warmly through the quiet town. Clara watched him for a long moment before answering. "A cowboy may know how to win a prairie." She smiled as Samuel looked up and caught her eye. "But a blacksmith knows how to build a home." Samuel tipped his hat, his smile still carrying the same quiet kindness that had first appeared beside a broken wagon so many years before. The steady rhythm of his hammer drifted through the afternoon like a faithful heartbeat. It had once mended wagons, school desks, bells, and broken roofs. In the end, it had also mended 2 lonely hearts. And if this story reminded you that the strongest love is often forged through quiet kindness instead of grand gestures, Share where you're watching from in the comments. And remember that sometimes the person who builds your safest home is the one who never asked for your heart in the first place.